Hey, Space Cadets, happy Tuesday. This is your pilot, Ryan Duffy, speaking, and I'm excited to welcome you back to another episode of the Pathfinder podcast. Today we are talking with Charles Beans about, quote, a day without space, end quote, digital jujitsu, woodworking, and SpiderOak, among other things. We will dig into SpiderOak, Charles' resume, the brave new world of cyber risks on orbit, and what we can do about it right after a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Kepler Communications, a company bringing the internet to space. Kepler is developing the infrastructure to support out-of-this-world communications by creating solutions that allow operators to access data in real time. The Kepler network will keep customers connected to on-orbit assets through optical inter-satellite links, which significantly increase capacity for mission-essential data downlinking to Earth. Kepler's services will expand your mission potential, all while solving current and future gaps in global space communications. Learn more about Kepler and how they are modernizing space communications. Visit kepler.space. Again, that's kepler.space. Charles is the executive chairman of SpiderOak, a startup focused on shoring up the digital defenses of satellites, space networks, and related ground infrastructure. The startup recently raised a $16.4 million Series C to develop, test, and fly OrbitSecure 2.0. OrbitSecure refers to SpiderOak's unique product offering that relies on zero trust encryption and distributed ledger technology. I am not going to try to define those technologies for you. That is what we are bringing Charles on for. So just to make sure I have my bases covered, I want to quickly hit on some other bullets from Charles' resume before we bring him on. He's the executive chairman of York Space Systems and co-founder and chairman of the SmallSat Alliance. In a past life, Charles also held executive positions in the Pentagon and served as the president of Vulcan Aerospace. At the DoD, Charles oversaw a $90 billion annual acquisition budget, mostly focused on remote sensing, space-based communications, and orbital launch services. Finally, he served 23 years on active duty as an Air Force Space and Intelligence officer and retired as a colonel. So, Space Cadets, with that out of the way, I think we are ready to dive into today's main event. Without further ado, Charles Beams. Charles, welcome to Pathfinder.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.
So I said Charles just now. I said Charles in the intro, but for the purposes of this conversation, do you prefer Charles or Chuck?
Well, all my space friends know me as Chuck, just because folks I've been in this business a long time, and that kind of thing. My partner is she's British, and so she just does not like the whole American Chuck thing. So she insists on. We've been together for a while, so she insists on Charles. So Chuck is wonderful. Make me feel at home.
Well, if the space community calls you Chuck, then I'm all for it. And there's an added benefit of it being easier to pronounce. So I'm all on board the Chuck train. So we have, we've gotten a glimpse of your bio here, but I want to just jump in right at the top to the SpiderOak, and in your own words, hear a little bit more about SpiderOak, your process or journey to becoming executive chairman. And then the news of the day, I'm getting it out of the way at the top, the significance of the recent fundraise, capital raise.
Sure, absolutely. I'm obviously I'm a bit of a fixture in the space community. I've been doing space things for a long time, and folks, when I popped up on the radar screen with SpiderOak, people said, "What the heck are you doing? Doing space cybersecurity?" And what some people know, but a lot of people don't, is that there was a period of time I was an appointee in Obama's first term, and I had, for working for Ash Carter, one of my responsibilities was oversight overall of the intelligence community, and that included the NSA. So I had to quickly become an expert on cybersecurity things, right? And so, and the big picture lesson I took from that was that it's hard. It was also at a time when the whole Ed Snowden thing blew up, right? So I got up close and personal with the different types of threats that can inside threats, all that sort of stuff. And then the other thing is, as a space guy, but I was more, as you probably know, I grew up on the national security side. The biggest threat has always been. Now they're publicly acknowledged. Space Force is publicly acknowledging it, but it's our biggest vulnerability. So it's always been in the back of my mind, but I've always been interested more in building satellites and all that kind of stuff, but I always knew this was a problem. And along comes, I'm giving a keynote at one of these symposiums, and this little company called SpiderOak approaches me and they said, we're a terrestrial cyber company, but we think that the way we do it uniquely suits the space domain. And they had a very well prepared sort of little pitch. And I was intrigued by it. And in fact, to the point we had follow-up conversations, this was about a year and a half ago, to the point I became convinced, I'm a technical guy too, that actually their approach does have the possibility, right, to actually solve, to be that sort of proverbial answer to the maiden's prayer. And so I'm an investor now and the chairman of the board of the company, and I'm very proud to consider myself an integral team member in that. And so anyway, that's how I got involved, and it's an exciting, great team. So we did this raise that went public. We went public with about 16.5 million, and it's to actually, we've already started the work, and in fact we already have the first instantiation of what's called OrbitSecure, right? Because it was already a revenue generating company. So, but what that 16 million does is it allows us to go all in on really solving this problem for the Space Force, and not just Space Force, but everybody.
Right. Okay. That's helpful to set the scene. That's a little bit unique, right? Wouldn't you say, for a space company is to be generating revenue relatively early into its unique. Life?
That's good. That's a good question, or a good statement. I would say yes, that's unique, but it's not unique. With me, it's not. Another company that I'm chairman of the board of is York, and we've had a very successful sort of run of it lately as well. So I frankly I like to build businesses that are profitable. You know what I mean? I'm kind of more of a blocking and tackling kind of simple guy that likes to look at problems, solve the problems, and figure out how to make a little bit of profit along the way.
Well, that's I think that's important, and the industry is in dire need of sort of that frame of thinking. Do you think that the media, and I would actually expand it to say just sort of the general public in space, not the general public, just the layperson, but the space community is beginning to see the cyber threat posed by near peer adversaries, and so here I'm referring to China and Russia, obviously, that they're waking up to the vulnerability and sort of threat vectors for space assets.
For the folks who are interested in space things, that's not everybody, but it's thanks to a lot of folks like Elon Musk and Bezos and all these, and Richard Branson, the sort of big branding kind of people. A lot of people have become sort of involved in some way, and I think that they are. I was shocked, candidly, the amount of folks that reached out to me that I knew from previous lives. As you said, this was my first rodeo, that wanted to talk to me more. In fact, other media outlets watched their competitors. They saw that. They saw what I did there, and so there's others reaching out to me as well. So, and as I mentioned on Maria's show, I'm not a political guy. I just really don't. If I have politics, really space, right? I love solving. I think space is an interesting engineering challenge, and it has elevated our standard of living tremendously, and continues to have great promise in that regard.
Right. I don't think you're going to get much disagreement here on this podcast. I know you just said that you're not political, but I have to ask, what's your posture on spy balloons? It's a very topical question, so I have to ask.
I'll tell you now that one's been shot down. I'll tell you, I was asked confidentially by folks what was my recommendation, and I feel reasonably comfortable saying that now. My suggestion was to try to capture it, but earlier on, as soon as it was entered, try to capture it and then bring it down, then exploit it technically, understand exactly what's on it, and then politely return all the contents, back to China. I think that would have been because it was. I view that whole thing more as it was a diplomatic maneuver by China, more so than anything that they collected could easily have been collected, and they probably are collecting to the maximum their ability with satellites, right? So I think that, and obviously we know through electronic measures, right? So
Yeah, totally. No, I woke up on Friday. We kind of had a crazy week, Taylor, last week, with between the team, most of the team being out in LA, and then I had a power outage here in Austin. And so I woke up Friday to write the newsletter, and there wasn't anything immediately jumping out. I convinced myself pretty quickly that the stratospheric spy balloon story was a good fit for us because, to your point, and that's how I concluded the story. Doesn't really seem like there's anything that could be collected from that you can't collect from low Earth orbit.
Right.
So who knows what the recover efforts will look like? I know that there's divers and ships out.
Yeah, I've read that. We'll see.
Where it's scattered, but
matter of fact, there was the whole balloon thing though has always been in conversation. I remember, say 15, 20 years ago, there was a big initiative by Air Force Space Command to look at, they called it near space at the time, which was the same thing. These very, very high altitude balloons. We were looking at it not so much from a threat perspective, but an opportunity. Was there something that could be done militarily to enhance Space Command's sort of overall capabilities by having much higher than actually that Chinese one, but having them at, say, 90, 100,000 feet? Turned out that it was very expensive. And again, it's just as easy and a lot cheaper to do it from low Earth orbit.
Yeah. For further reading or listening, I would encourage folks to go back and listen to the episode that we had with Brian from Illyria, because that talks about it from like a civil or not so really commercial perspective. They're using a lot of the technology that was originally developed from Loon, but we sorry to everyone. I digress. I can't get enough of the spy balloon topic, but I'll get us back on track here. What do you think of the cat and mouse? And maybe that's not the best framing, but the sort of offensive and defensive side of the equation as it relates to satellite communications, jamming, and that sort of thing in Ukraine. And of course, in the lead up to Ukraine, there was that big intrusion. I don't know, compromise of the ground part of the ground segment. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, since you're basically at the center of all of this, and you've sat at multiple ends of the table as it relates to this topic.
I have really. It's an interesting question. I would say that a few sort of high level comments. That one, we're kind of, this idea that we're either at war or we're not at war is a bit of a oversimplification. There's always, when it comes to nation state sort of interactions, there's always, it's a continuum, right? And so we always need to remember that. And one of the key things in that continuum, especially during the Cold War, this was true. They called them electronic countermeasures and then electronic counter. So ECM, then ECCM, countermeasures. And that was always, I think cat and mouse is a reasonable sort of way to depict it. It's this thing that kind of goes on. What people like, and this is both the U.S. and our near peer adversaries, is that a lot of those effects are reversible. They're deniable. So you always have to be on your game, right? Because you can't just say, oh, they just fired a weapon into the DMZ and here's the evidence. It's these things can be fleeting. So it's something we have to take as a country, we have to take very, very seriously. I think we're going to see more and more of it, frankly, especially as there's this blurring between government systems that are clearly and then commercial systems that the government leverages, right? So we're just going to have to be very mindful of that.
Yeah. Is this related to the concept of the gray zone? And I just went out of the frame for a second because this is a report that I did in grad school at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm actually not going to waste 30 seconds to read out the full title, but we did a report as part of the intelligence studies project. If you could send it to me, I'd like to read it. I will. Young. I mean, it's a little. It was July 2018. And it was a report. It was on interagency collaboration between special forces and the IC in the war on the war on terror. So
did you? I don't know if I saw your report on this, but I'll tell you. All kidding aside, Ken Tovo, who's on our advisory board, he was very much in the middle of a lot of that work, that integration work between active duty. He was the commander of the JSOC, Joint Special Operation Command, and he has published what he could unclassified on that very topic. So I all kidding aside, I'd be very curious to see what conclusions. I'm assuming none of you had security clearances, or did you?
No. Well, there might have been security clearances, but they weren't for they weren't used for.
It was all
for this
unclassified.
research. There were folks. Yeah. It was all unclassified. But I'll link up with you. But yeah, back to the concept of the gray zone. Are those two things like related? And this.
What do you mean? I'm not familiar with that specific term. I may be maybe in a different context. I don't know. Gray zone. What is that?
Like just the idea that there are measures that one could take that aren't that maybe would fall short of like a hot war.
Absolutely. But that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that cybersecurity kind of is.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Example. Right. Like if gray meaning somewhere between black and white, I guess. Right. So yeah, I would say
exactly.
I would absolutely say that is true. And there's different shades of gray there, frankly, because that gets to this point where really, even with people that are our allies, it's not that we're ever going to go to war against an ally, but there's a power struggle there. So we share some things with some allies and we don't share with others, and that's a calculation that's well specified in hierarchy of command and all that kind of stuff. Countermeasures, spoofing, lot of, I'm also I was an intelligence officer. And so I'm aware of the tactics, techniques, et cetera, associated with how to conduct operations where you need to sort of obscure certain things and emphasize other things and all that.
That's helpful. Chuck, what do you think the level of vulnerability is for a cyber attack or some sort of incident on a satellite system? And you can speak broadly to civil, commercial, and military assets, or you could break it up and go kind of sector by sector.
It's a good question. I guess a simple answer is I'm actually far more worried today than I was even 10 years ago. And I was worried 10 years ago, but the sophistication of our near peer people is much greater now. And so that is a big thing on the commercial civil front. It has to do with, as I mentioned on Maria's show, it has to do with cyber crimes, ransomware, because I kind of put it all into one big lump. And that's a huge concern. You talk to people, small business owners, medical offices, stuff like that the ransomware thing is a big vulnerability. And folks are working on that. We at SpiderOak, we'd like to someday help them out, but frankly, national security is our highest priority. So that's what we're moving out on. On the national security side, very worried and the reason why I'm very worried is because in that sort of risk impact kind of matrix that you look at, the impact could be awful. If I understand, just in the open media, for example, the OCX, which is the GPS next generation ground system, huge cyber vulnerabilities. Well, if those get compromised, the ground system that flies the GPS satellites, if that gets compromised, you have to remember it's not just soldiers in the field, which is a huge thing that could run into trouble, but it's also our whole banking system, everything. Our modern way of life in America is tied to that timing signal, that clock on the GPS satellite, and that's pretty frightening. I mean, if from a standpoint of taking down temporarily things like the NASDAQ or whatever, it could cause serious injury.
Yeah. So that, in my mind, then begs the question: should space have its own designation as a critical infrastructure sector? Because it of course is cross-cutting with I pulled them up while we were talking communications, defense, industrial base, and energy. But it goes all the way. Basically, kind of touches all of these. But do you think it should have its own as well?
I do, and I'm an advocate of market-based economics and free market stuff and commercial things. But what gets missed sometimes, I'm also very much in favor of well-regulated here, and because of that fact, right? We need our government needs to be, and frankly, the Pentagon's doing a pretty good job moving in this direction. But they need to think of this commercial space as a marketplace that they need to work to keep healthy. And all that kind of thing, and also available for surge and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it absolutely, it's beyond being critical infrastructure. Without space, we used to talk about a day without space in the Air Force days, but actually at that time we would always look at it from a standpoint of how does it impact our ability to fight a war, and it is very consequential there. But actually now in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be really significant. That it's critical infrastructure, much like Colonial Pipeline, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, a day without space, that's pretty catchy. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on that thread. What do you think the consequences would be if there was a wide-ranging compromise of multiple sort of space systems or assets?
Sure. Well, I can tell you it's been studied extensively. There's the unclassified stuff that I think I could probably find some links and send to you on that topic. And then there's the classified impacts, and the classified impacts are enormous. But they reveal vulnerabilities that obviously we don't want to tell our enemies about.
Yeah.
But a day without space is frightening, because the U.S. we fought the Cold War. The way we fight wars is with technology, right? That's our asymmetric advantage. We apply American know-how. They used to call it Yankee ingenuity when I was a kid, but that kind of a thing applied to is what we are able to. It's how we were able to win in the industrial age. That was it was our ability to ramp up for World War II. That really turned the tide, both in the Pacific and the European theater. Now in the information age, it's our tech sector, and very much one of the things that doesn't really get acknowledged all that much, because I don't know, for some reason the military doesn't like to say it this way, but essentially the Space Force and the assets, it's mostly about satellites and the what they do for terrestrial war fighting, right? And what a satellite essentially is you can think of it as a computer server on orbit that's solar powered, and it does something with information. But information is the central, it's either collecting information or transmitting information from one part of the world to another. That's essentially what it does. And so in the information age, we're the best in the world at tech. We need to leverage, not compete against it. We need to leverage that marketplace of ideas and skill sets to make sure we win the space race. The key to winning the space race, as I said to Maria, is actually, it's no longer rocket science, it's data science.
Okay. All right. That also is catchy. See, like I said, this isn't your first rodeo. I think you have a keen grasp on sort of ways to succinctly.
I've been in this a long time, and I'm an engineer that I've been told is pretty good with words. So
there you go. That's a great competency to have, those dual competencies. And do you think that, I actually want to take the second half of the show, and we'll go take a quick break in a second here, but do you think that the government and private sector, broadly speaking, are taking the threat as seriously as in your mind, it warrants? Are there specific sort of agents, and I guess we can go to the government side, but agencies that really get it and are kind of blazing their own trail or leading the way here?
I think they get it. I think all of them get it, actually. And I'll just tell you, a guy that worked in the Pentagon for quite a long time myself, they get it. They understand the threat. The concern is my concern, and it's actually their concern too, is we're not moving fast enough to address it. Like, they understand, they meaning just the folks that are responsible for that kind of, they understand the significance of it and the imperative. But all really the Pentagon is geared really to do is manage money, the flow of money. not really to solve problems. So it's 35,000 people who manage the whole budgeting process, which is very complicated for the entire Defense Department, right? Which is hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a vitally important function. They mostly get it right. Obviously, that kind of money, there's going to be some challenges, little gotchas and stuff like that. But the question is, how do you quickly change that into something that can go at the speed at which the tech sector, the cybersecurity sector is advancing, and that threat. And that's the thing and that's what I write about personally. And that's what I like to talk about, because I think that the only answer really to move as fast is to basically leverage the same industrial base. And so that it's a little bit what I call a digital jujitsu move, right? We basically use the energy of the sector for our own national security purposes, and I think that's the only solution, frankly.
Right.
So there's another little catchy term for you.
Absolutely. I mean, digital jujitsu. That could very well be the name of this, but I love it. And I want to talk a little bit more about bridging the gap, but we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Time for another word from our sponsor, Kepler Communications. Space operators face many downlinking roadblocks today, and they rely on decades-old technology to access critical data. Kepler is solving the downlink bottleneck by providing real-time access to satellite data, optimized latency, and high-speed downlinking capabilities. The company's hybrid network will modernize on-orbit communications with a combination of optical technology, S-band inter-satellite links, and a high-speed backhaul link to move data more efficiently back to Earth. Kepler offers a full stack of solutions with payload technology, spectrum licenses, ground infrastructure, and a satellite constellation with full orbital coverage to satisfy the entire communications requirements of your mission. Check out Kepler.space for more information. Again, that's Kepler.space. So we'll hop back on here. Why is, in the press release and marketing materials for SpiderOak, you see the word, and you've tossed it around yourself a bit at the top half of the show, this concept of COTS, which is short for commercial off the shelf. And we'll probably say COTS quite a bit here over the next 20 minutes. Why? And you sort of started to talk a bit more about it right before the break, but can you speak to the importance of that? And I don't know if necessarily plug and play is like the exact right complementary term, but this general concept of not having to build an entire system, bespoke system from the ground up, and why that's important.
Well, I guess, I'm candidly, I'm not a big fan of the plug and play sort of moniker, but the idea of an off the shelf thing or private companies and all that, the biggest advantage, there's lots of advantages to it, but the biggest one is that we can move very fast, right? The process by which the government needs to develop weapons systems and stuff like that is very deliberate. Congress has a vote in that for very good reasons, because they're weapons systems. They kill people, right? That has to be deliberated in a legislative body. That's a very important thing. But for those things that are not that, and there's a high degree of need for innovation, and just speed, frankly, to fielding things. Private capital is just much more efficient and much quicker at getting the right resources to the right people to do these things. And the government, and there's so much of it, frankly, that the government can sit back and start looking at it much the way when you and I shop for a car or for a computer. You just look at the marketplace and say, which one best meets my needs? And then that becomes the signal to the market of where to invest their capital into the future. You can't do that with fighter jets, right? You can't do that with aircraft carriers, but you can do that with the bulk, frankly, of satellite systems and the ground infrastructure associated with it. For those that you cannot, you can leverage a lot of the parts. For example, I'll just give you an example. A lot of people like me, they can relate to hardware better than software. York Space Systems is another company of mine. We manufacture satellites and operate them for customers, right? Well, we do commercial things that are completely off the shelf, but we also do military satellites. But it still uses mostly commercial off-the-shelf components, right? And I think that some of these satellites are highly, highly classified, but really they're leveraging 80% of it is commercial things. And I think we need to think about that for the cybersecurity way of doing things also, because it's moving very quickly. Cybersecurity is as much of a private concern of private citizens as it is to the military. And a lot of the technologies can be leveraged. A good example, again, would be SpiderOak, right? It was a terrestrial company that was doing a good business, going along, doing its thing. It just so happens with this zero trust sort of architecture implementation that we have, where we use blockchain technology, it meshes very well with where the Space Force wants to take satellite systems into the future.
Right. With the sort of proliferated architecture, and like the concept of more nodes, and rather than one big bird
and
flying.
More nodes, and also there's a desire to do onboard processing at those nodes, right? So that they want to have these machine learning, these AI algorithms to even if they just do simple sorting and stuff like that, to be able to do that on orbit to save time. Whether it's missile warning stuff or whatever, and so it just so happens that the technology was originally invented, frankly, for the ground. For purely commercial customers, ends up being very, very useful for the government. Right.
Yeah. Well, early on in Pathfinder's young life, SpiderOak was a sponsor of the podcast, and it took me a while to be able to say zero trust architectures and that sort of thing. But now I got it nailed down. But I've said it so many times, I'm still not comfortable with my level of knowledge. So I'm hoping that you can help me get a little bit up the learning curve in as sort of simple of a way as possible, and kind of elegantly. Can you explain to us, to not just me, of course, but to the audience, what the significance of zero trust is? Because I did mention this off air, and I think I mentioned it in correspondence with you and your team. This is a very hot topic. I don't want to say buzzword, because it's not just a buzzword. It's an entire concept, framework, and
there's a presidential policies on things.
So
I mean,
so say a bit more about that.
Sure. It's well, first of all, because it's not a buzzword, but there's a broad interpretation of it. So lots of people, for example, a virtual private network is a type of zero trust environment, right? In other words, you have to have encryption keys in order to enter into that VPN. If you want to dial into a VPN and you're overseas, you can do that, but you have to have that key, right? All that kind of thing. But so that's considered zero trust. But ultimately, what zero trust means is that you assume that you don't trust the environment that you're in, right? And so you kind of wall off anything. So, for example, a VPN means that you can when you dial into a VPN, you don't have to trust the hardware that's on there if you're in that little network, right? Now, somebody may have an application that is surreptitiously running on that thing that then can get into the VPN on your device, and you wouldn't know it. So it's not a true VPN in the SpiderOak sense, or it's not a true zero trust in the SpiderOak sense. But our implementation of zero trust assumes you trust nothing. You trust nothing on the network, and all you need to do is you have to think of like a VPN, but put a VPN around each data record that gets transmitted. Each little piece of information that you want to protect has its own little security wrapper around it. It has its own little encryption key, and that's all managed through the OrbitSecure software. So you don't realize it, right? You don't see it. But we've had people try to break our system, really capable people, and they couldn't do it. And so our implementation of zero trust is at what we call at the data level. Think of it like, for people that worked in national security, there's a thing called a SCIF, right? Which is a room that where you can put classified information and it secures them. Nobody can come in or out of that SCIF unless they have the proper clearances and all that. It's like putting a SCIF around each separate data record that is transmitted through. It could be the dirtiest routers, the dirtiest environment, the dirtiest Wi-Fi networks, satellites, doesn't matter. That data is protected by its own encryption cell.
Okay.
And it's all very transparent. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. One would imagine that this would apply then to, the sort of command and control when you're flying a satellite, as well as downlinking data. And
both. Exactly.
Kind of the whole life cycle. Yeah.
Right. Because you don't want the enemy to be able to take over your satellite. That's command and control, as you know. Mm-hmm. But then also you don't want somebody to see what was collected by a satellite necessarily, right? Or
increasingly what was analyzed. Right.
Right. I was just going to say that. Yep, exactly. Or if you're going to collect a specific thing with a specific sensor, you have to. There's a plan. There's a sequence of command and control events that go to that, and so obviously you don't want to corrupt that data, but you may want to just protect that so that nobody else knows that that's what you're using. So let's say it's a commercial satellite, and you want to collect against a specific target in North Korea, but you don't want anybody else on that commercial network to know. Well, OrbitSecure provides the software to allow that to happen where nobody else would know except for the people that have that encryption key, which could be only the computer on the satellite that actually turns the camera, moves the camera, and the person way down at the other end that's an analyst sitting in St. Louis, Missouri, that's actually going to look at that image and exploit it for some intelligence purpose.
Awesome. Okay. What's unique about, we talked a little bit about how this SpiderOak technology was developed kind of for terrestrial context, but it works well for space. What is unique about operating in space as it relates to information and cybersecurity? There are some obvious reasons that it's a lot different. But as my mental model, and it's evolved as I've been able to, speak with smart folks like yourself. But when I was first, joining Payload and getting up to speed, like my mental model was the concept that a lot of hardware that was put on orbit, and this probably applies a bit more to in MEO and GEO, like rather than like low Earth orbit, which is all the rage these days. But satellites that are bigger, more expensive to build, not as easily replaceable for a whole host of reasons. And a lot of them have, like a lot of those satellites are like slightly younger than me. Just to and I'm not that, you said I'm not that young. And so, they have like analog systems and I don't really, another concept in software and tech is like this concept, and Tesla's obviously done a really good job with this over the air software updates. I'm not sure to the extent what a lot of those systems that can be done. Am I directionally correct with that sort of interpretation? Of course, things are different in LEO.
That's a part of it, and it's actually a big part of it. The other thing too is that as we're going from GEO to LEO, the proliferated LEO, as you said, there's a need for these satellites to talk to each other in LEO. Whereas that wasn't the case when things were big and they were in GEO. And even in MEO, they typically just it was just the satellite to a ground station, and that was it, and that was kind of how it worked. But now we want to leverage a lot of the networking technologies that have come out of Silicon Valley and leverage that in low Earth orbit as well. And just think of LEO as being they even call it a mesh network, right? And so that means onboard processing and all that kind of stuff. So there's kind of two things. There's the point-to-point versus the mesh. That's a big one. So that would probably be, I would say, the biggest. The other one that is worth mentioning is the fact that most security solutions require continuous contact between the two objects, the two devices, if you will, that are there. Because there's a clock typically that syncs up and that provides the ability to, but that's not required for OrbitSecure, because again, because of our implementation uses a distributed ledger technology, this blockchain technology. Just like if you, I don't know if you do Bitcoin stuff or anything like that, but you don't have to. Your Bitcoin account does not have to. What's that?
I said I've had a phase.
Oh, okay, all right. Hopefully, you didn't lose too much. but
no,
if
no,
you know,
no.
you don't have to. You don't have to. That account doesn't have to stay in continuous contact, right? It's contained. The security apparatus for those Bitcoin are contained within this. Actually, in that case, it's a single ledger that everyone sort of registers with. In our case, it's multiple ledgers, but it's the same idea where you can have completely disaggregated. So you can have satellites that lose connectivity, which is typical, especially in low Earth orbit. They lose connectivity for periods of time, and everything remains completely secure. You don't have this break, and you don't have to reset your crypto gear and all that kind of stuff, which is what happens in a normal world. The old world.
Right. And I'm gonna actually have our Peter, our producer, toss some of these slides up over this kind of portion of the conversation. But I'll also read out sort of the data points that are most of interest for the purposes of this conversation. Payload and SpiderOak a while back, in 2022, probably late 2022, we ran a survey of our audience. And, the normal disclaimers apply. It was like opt-in, it's not non-scientific, that sort of thing. But that methodological sort of caveat out of the way, we obviously have a very space savvy, like space focused community who work in the industry or work on the government side. And so the data points of interest that I'm going to pluck out here is, on average, how long would it take your organization to recover from a successful cyber attack on a satellite or other space adjacent system? About 35% said days. Just over 10% said hours. Similar amount for weeks, and then there was a single digit but non-trivial, non-zero amount that said months. So curious for your interpretations of that and whether that sort of stacks up with, or that checks out with what you have seen on both sides of the table and kind of across the industry. And then I'll pull out one more slide. Stop there to give you a chance to react.
It's an interesting question. And I think it's a good question. I would say it would depend on the nature of the attack and, in other words, how we were attacked and then what was attacked. If it were a government system that were attacked, I would say it would be months, frankly, because the government, it's very difficult for the government to sort of react and change stuff. But I think if it's a more commercial like system, it could be minutes or hours. And that has to do with, look at Starlink, for example, right?
That's exactly, yes, you beat me to the punch. That's the example that I was going to ask.
And there's been attacks that I can't talk about that were like of a similar nature, where it was not a matter of hours kind of reaction time the way Starlink was able to do that. And that's just because, again, the government is built, especially the acquisition system is built to design and develop, acquire, if you will, weapon systems, right? And those things are, again, like I said earlier, it's a very deliberate process, necessary, because you're talking about serious lethality. Information systems now are every bit of critical infrastructure, but in and of themselves, they don't kill people. So what we need to do is we need to have this sort of hybrid thinking along those lines. And I think the sort of basic methods by which I kind of described, where we leverage commercial off the shelf, is a good solution.
Yeah. So I'm going to do two birds with one stone here. I'm going to keep us on the survey, but move us along into what I've taken to call a few tough questions, the max Q part of the interview. And so the next graph that I have up here is how many third-party vendors and service providers does your data pass through? And the over 30% is 1 to 10, over which is, that's kind of a broad range, but the next one is 10 to 25, and that's plus 20%. And then there's single digits for 25 to 50 and 50 plus, like a similar amount. why would a company or a government want to increase that sort of number? Working with like SpiderOak. Of course, I don't need to tell or remind you, but I think a good example is in Austin, like the supply chain attack on SolarWinds. That was a while ago, but that's of course that's the risk, and I would imagine that it's still a particularly acute risk for space based systems, just given the complexity of the supply chains. So what I'm saying is why I continue to like why I work with a third party for your security.
Because there really isn't a choice, and it has to do with, because remember, when you're fighting a war, you're defending the country. You have now guardians, but you had airmen, soldiers, Marines, and they're young. They come from a generation of tech, and they need to, so they have to fight with the way they grew up, the tools that they grew up with, and all that stuff. So we cannot issue guardians gear from like the 1960s. It's not going to work. And frankly,
sure.
And so that's a big part of it, actually. And then because part of it is, I'll just give you I like stories to kind of make the point. GPS is a great one, right? That was, people don't know this, but it was developed to have a nuclear survivable navigation tool to assure the Soviet Union that even if they struck first, we would still be able to level Moscow. It was all about deterrence theory. Right? We never thought, when we were developing that system, I was a lieutenant. We never thought about things today, like the whole rideshare economy. There's so much that's completely dependent on it now. But we ran into a problem because in the field, the service, it's an open secret. The services are horrible at fielding what they call user equipment, which is basically GPS on your iPhone. And so they were never able to do it. So what happens is all the soldiers in the field, they just use their iPhones. Well, iPhones are not really protected because the government bureaucratically said, well, we're not going to secure those. But then the soldiers like, well, yeah, but your other thing doesn't even work at all. So at least this works most of the time. And so that's kind of the situation at the field out there at the forward edge where they're fighting wars and stuff. And so we need to acknowledge that. And understand that we're a citizen sort of military, right? So we don't. Right. These aren't conscripts. These are people we want to recruit. Yeah. We want it to be an interesting thing, and also we're a technology country that we don't win. The Soviets wanted to fight against the U.S. with just mass, just like they're trying to do with Ukraine today. The Russia now, but it's the same thing, right? They just want to overwhelm Ukraine with just throwing hundreds of thousands of bodies and tanks and everything. And the U.S. way of war is actually to minimize human casualty and use technology to deter war first, and then to overwhelm if possible. That doesn't work in a lot of situations, especially civil war type of situations. But on the traditional, mass against mass thing, it works very well, and it's been our sort of thing. So we have to leverage our commercial industry. We can't afford, and then the other thing is affordability. Yeah. We cannot afford to have a whole separate infrastructure anymore. It's too expensive. Our debt situation is out of control.
Two more questions on this list, and then I'll move us along to the lightning round because I want to be mindful of your time. And depending on whether we can go a few minutes over, you can pick or answer both of these questions. But the first is, how does SpiderOak stay focused when dealing with the diverse mission needs between civil, commercial, and military space? I would think that context switching might impact sort of ability to execute or operate, maybe not. And then the second one is there's famously a shortage of really skilled cyber experts like the workforce, and that's not like a hot take or breaking news. So how does SpiderOak on the open marketplace for talent as we've referred to in this conversation, how does it out recruit bigger infosec companies?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. because
Okay.
people is the most important. I'm a big believer that people is the most
Yeah.
important thing. And so we think a lot about that. In fact, we just had it last week. We had an executive offsite where we talked about the whole people side of it. Well, first of all, people are attracted to SpiderOak because we're doing something very interesting. We're not selling pet food on the internet, right? We're doing something that's very
Yeah.
leading edge. It's interesting, and so we get a lot of sort of early in their career type software people that are interested in doing that. We're able to pay pretty well because we are a commercial company, so we're not limited by the what's called the DCAA, which is an agency of the Pentagon that sets labor rates and all that kind of stuff. So we have some flexibility there as well. And then also on the people front, we solve a cybersecurity problem, but we do it in a different way. And so we don't need to necessarily, we do have obviously cybersecurity professionals on our staff, but we can leverage people that in the workforce who are they're not cybersecurity professionals. They're awesome code people, right? But they're people that maybe they're experts in distributed ledger technology, blockchain stuff, right? Which is not something normally that would come from the cybersecurity world. So that's
right. Sure.
That's our sort of secret sauce. And I'm sorry, in the first question, what was it again?
Context switching between.
The simple answer there is we and this is I think this is a bit of my influence. Frankly, I've been on just over a year now. In the leadership team, we listen very closely to the customers, right? It's again much like other companies that I've been with in the past. I'm a passionate believer in not just responding to the customer like a McDonald's customer, but really listening to them and then helping them really understand their problem, and then helping them to see our solution to their problem, right? And I think any successful business begins with that. Sometimes the problem is a problem the customer doesn't actually see. They don't realize it's a problem, but it needs to be, so they need to be educated on that. And I'm not saying that as some euphemism for slick marketing. I mean, really, it needs to be a problem. And sometimes, and cybersecurity is a big one. I was very aware of that for a long time. We couldn't talk about it publicly. Thankfully now, with the creation of the Space Force, people are a little bit looser about talking about space things, and so we can talk about these things more openly. But it's an enormous challenge, and I invite. Obviously, I think SpiderOak's the best company out there, but I invite all the companies to participate in the solution set here, because the Space Force needs all of us, frankly, to make this work and protect the country. Yeah. So I think that's really it. As far as adjudication of priority of the different projects and stuff, we review them at the executive level, and we kind of make very deliberate, allocation of human capital associated with that.
Right. Well, fair enough, Chuck. I, for one, appreciate that you've been open and willing to share some of those nuggets about things that you might not have been able to talk about in the past. Really quickly, lightning round. The first one, let's talk about hobbies, or maybe a hobby in particular. A little birdie told me that you love woodworking. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that passion came to be?
Oh, sure. It's funny. I do. I'm a cabinet maker. I've never sold anything professionally, but I've made hundreds of things, furniture of different types. And I love it because I think everyone needs to have a hobby, frankly. It's a good, no matter how much you love your work, I think you need that diversion. And mine just happens to be something that's useful, as saves me a little money come Christmas time, giving gifts and that kind of thing. And now for anyone that's listening and they're saying, how come I haven't gotten a piece of furniture from Chuck Beams? I just say, hold on, your piece is coming.
But, it's not necessarily super scalable. You're just one man. What's your favorite thing? What's the favorite your favorite item that you've made
that I've ever made?
And on the flip side, what's the most painstaking, tedious one that you made?
Well, I will say there's parts of it that I love to do, and then there's parts of it that you have to do in order to have a product that you're proud of, right? And I like to make personal gifts. that are. But the thing I love to do is design them, because I don't build to print. Like I don't get a design from somebody and I actually design the thing on paper before I ever start making sawdust, right? And then, but I love to make things that are very personal, family members, friends, that kind of a thing. I won't talk about any of those. I will talk about one that I loved making. I was a student at the National War College a long time ago, and it was the 100th anniversary of the place. President Roosevelt was the president at the time, and he loomed large. I'm a big Teddy Roosevelt fan, just by coincidence. But the name of the hall is called Roosevelt Hall, where the National War College is. It's actually in D.C. And so we were the 100th anniversary of the class or whatever. And so people found out, like you did, somehow they found out that I'm this cabinet maker guy. So the building historian, she said, I understand that your class would like to, as the class gift, would like to give something that you made. And I'm like, well, maybe, I don't know. So she comes with this idea of a cabinet, right? And then it would house a bunch of things from the Teddy Roosevelt presidency. And so but of course, she's the building historian, so it has to fit the period and blah, blah, blah. So it was a huge challenge. I loved it, but it was a lot of work. And I had to collect up the revenue. Yeah, exactly. So my classmates all funded the wood and all the hardware and the glass and all that kind of stuff. And so I came up with the design that Teddy Roosevelt was a veteran too, right? So I actually designed it after a gun cabinet type of look, where you have the lock cabinets on the bottom and then beautiful glass doors above. But the thing ended up being enormous. It's like 15 feet long. It's 9 feet tall, 2.5 feet deep. And it's in Roosevelt Hall. If you ever are there, it's funny. I built it, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago, but it's there. And so people go back now to be guest speakers, guest lecturers, and they'll see it there, and they'll see my little name, Lieutenant Colonel Beams, down in the corner. And they're like, "Was that you?" I said, "Yeah, actually, it was." Anyway, that's probably awesome. My proudest. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure one of our listeners will be there much sooner than me. So if anyone is going to be there, keep an eye out. No, I'll see it eventually. I'm just not on the order of weeks, but I'm going to make an executive decision here rather than do my standard fare for the lightning round. We're going to rename for this episode. It was just the woodworking round. So I think that's an excellent note for us to close out on. So thanks Chuck so much for coming on, and let's hope and optimistically close out here that we never see a day without space.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, Space Cadets, that will do it for Pathfinder 0035. My mind is still spinning a bit. I definitely hope that we never have a day without space. I hope that you agree, but I'm gonna read us out pretty quickly here. Pathfinder is powered by Payload and produced by Peter Jean. If you like what you heard, leave us a review and reading wherever you're listening to this, or better yet, share the show with a fellow space nut. Next Tuesday, we will be talking with 2 top space headhunters to get an inside look at talent and recruiting trends across the industry. Until then, I am Ryan Duffy signing off, and I will see you back here next week.